Welcome to the 2019 GLF here in Luxembourg. It is our fourth and final meeting of this year where we will be discussing breakthroughs in sustainable finance. I'm Natasha Elkington and I'll be your host for today. And I'd like to welcome our first guest, Augusta Senenssie. Augusta sits on the Plans International's Youth Advisory Panel and is the founder of Gatekeepers, an ethnographic research consultancy specialising in Indigenous communities and disparate groups. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Lovely. So we'll just jump into our questions. Okay, so tell us a bit more about what your work involves on Plan International's advisory panel.
I sat on Plan International's advisory panel at the start of this year, and the role of a youth advisory panelist is to amplify the role and the experiences around the world. So that involves meeting key stakeholders like CEOs, executives, representing Plan with our consultation Department of International Development, and just making sure that our policies and reports are inclusive and give the best portrayal of the experiences of women and girls everywhere.
Wow. Quite interesting and amazing. And then you have a research consultancy, Gatekeepers.
Yes.
Tell us more about that, please.
So I've been fortunate enough to be working within the fields of policy and development for the last 8 years, and I was kind of getting a bit frustrated at the slow rate and inclusion of disparate community and Indigenous groups. So I thought, why not start something myself? Nice. And the idea of Gatekeepers was born. We're in the early stages of just collating data and research, but the intention is to amplify the experiences of Indigenous groups and share these findings with key stakeholders to work on tangible policy solutions to make sure that all voices are represented within policy.
Wow, amazing. And when did you start this again, you said?
So we actually started the organisation in August, and we've just started the funding rounds and collecting research.
Okay, amazing. Very interesting. So I understand you've been travelling around the world to understand how Indigenous communities and displaced people are excluded from policy decisions as part of your work. So what are some of the most interesting findings?
So I was working with the University of Sydney to understand Indigenous communities, learn about their realities, but I also got to spend some time living with the Indigenous communities of Western Sydney and Victoria. Amazing. And meeting some of the elders and community leaders, I understood the extent and the crises that people face in Australia. It's quite surprising to see such a developed country treating their Indigenous population with such contempt.
Wow, and is this situation going to change? So by finding all this, doing the research, how is this going to change then?
So I was fortunate enough to sit down with a few legislators in Australia and present my findings, as well as a preliminary report that I drafted about my experiences with the communities. And there were a lot of kind of platitudes and recognitions that what was going on in Australia wasn't sustainable. But I understand that it's an ongoing process. So I've been partnering with a few Indigenous organisations as well to kind of help them start applying pressure to the government to make sure that their interests and land rights are recognised.
Great, because I was just thinking about this the other day, with all the fires happening in Australia, but you don't hear the Aboriginal voice. You don't hear, what they're saying about what's going on, because I'm sure they have their own way of understanding what's happening, but no one's going to them to ask them how to even solve this problem, right?
And bizarrely, I went to an Indigenous research conference while I was in Sydney, and one of the Indigenous leaders was talking about the fact that if Australian farmers expropriated the lands the way that Indigenous people know how to do, there wouldn't be such severe land fires. And it just made me kind of frustrated, because if we actually spent more time learning from Indigenous communities, a lot of these ecological crises that we're facing could be averted. So you're absolutely spot on there.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I'm like, when you read the news, there's nothing coming from them. I'm like, why isn't anyone going to talk to them and see what they're doing in natural ways or different ways of handling this problem, right? Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're doing the work that you're doing, because it has to change. It definitely has to change. So as part of your work, I'm talking about the overview now, with Indigenous communities and disparate groups. What's your overview of the situation in general around the world?
I think that governments and organisations become more populist, right-wing, and kind of unfeeling towards the other. We're seeing the kind of narratives and discourses of Indigenous and disparate communities excluded from policy considerations. And whilst that might seem like a temporary victory, the long-term consequences of that will come back to haunt us. Right. These communities live on the forefront of ecological ruin and climate crises. They know what works and what doesn't work. And ignoring their voices or trying to Western-splain our solutions to development, I think, is going to be problematic. And I think we need to listen to them more.
I totally agree. But I know you've also sat with government officials and policymakers challenging them on their policies. Are they listening?
I'd say for the most part, some do.
Okay.
I think more organised and established institutions are less receptive to young voices. Sometimes it can feel like a bit tokenistic to be there, and it's more about kickboxing that a young person is there rather than actually listening to what we have to say. But I think increasingly governments and organisations are realising that just because we're young doesn't mean that we don't have the experience or expertise to bring about positive change.
Right.
And so I think that we're starting to see a shift in the narrative and people becoming a lot more responsive to our ideas. But it takes a lot of time, and I think that with the ongoing kind of climate crisis and seeing young activists rising up and taking charge, I think that governments are starting to take note.
And we don't have time to to waste, right? We're like kind of in a crucial point here. So it's like we have to listen now or yesterday actually, if we're going to solve the climate crisis. Exactly. So I wanted to ask you about, an Indigenous community rights and voices are important to consider discussing land restoration opportunities and climate action financing. So why are their rights important in terms of financing?
Yeah. I think for the simple fact that Indigenous populations account for 5% of the global population, but occupy 25% of all land. That is an enormous amount of surface, and they've had these systems and these lands for centuries, millennia even, and they understand how these processes work. They understand the biodiversity and ecosystems that exist within them. Why are we not utilising their voices within landscape financing? It's absolutely bizarre to me, because we go into these communities and we think that we have, with all of our degrees and our expertise, that we somehow know the best kind of solutions for these communities. But when you actually go and learn from these groups, you realise that a lot of the sciences that we think that we've discovered actually come from oral traditions, from Indigenous groups. So I think there's definitely a partnership to be had there, and I think if we are more responsive and receptive to the Indigenous voice and narratives, we could completely transform the face of landscape financing.
I completely agree with you. And so, final question for today. So is this your first GLF?
It is indeed,
okay,
yeah.
Lovely. So I guess, you're my first interview, so you haven't had the experience of the day, but what do you hope to get out from here, to take away from this conference?
I hope to be challenged by a lot of panels, to get rightfully angry about a few things, but to learn a bit more about how I can incorporate and use the existing means and the financial means to help amplify projects that I work on.
Okay, great. Well, I hope you do. I hope you do meet interesting people, and that we do change the narrative in terms of getting Indigenous voices and women's voices and the youth involved in how we're going to make some breakthroughs in sustainable finance. Okay, lovely. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And I wish you a lovely day. Thank you.